The wrench slipped from her trembling hands, clattering against the ceramic tiles as water cascaded from the broken pipe beneath the kitchen sink. Sarah Chen stood frozen, watching her pristine hardwood floors transform into a small lake, knowing that in 15 minutes her mother-in-law would arrive for their monthly inspection disguised as a family dinner. The irony wasn't lost on her that she, a licensed contractor who'd built decks and renovated entire bathrooms for strangers, couldn't fix a simple leak in her own home without her husband questioning every move she made. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah had always been the type of woman who could figure things out. Growing up in her father's hardware store in Millbrook, she'd learned to thread pipe before she could properly braid her hair. While other kids played video games, she was in the back workshop, learning the difference between a Phillips head and a flathead, understanding that sometimes the simplest problems require the most patience. Her father, David Chen, had immigrated from Taiwan with nothing but a toolbox and an unshakable belief that honest work could build any life you wanted. He'd taught her that skills were currency, that self-reliance was freedom, and that there was no shame in getting your hands dirty if it meant standing on your own 2 feet. Those lessons had carried her through college, where she'd shocked her engineering professors by choosing construction management over software development. They'd warned her about the challenges a woman would face in such a male-dominated field, but Sarah had simply smiled and reminded them that she'd been the only girl in shop class since middle school. She'd graduated summa cum laude, earned her contractor's license at 24, and spent the next 6 years building a reputation as someone who showed up on time, stayed under budget, and never left a job half-finished. Then she met David Williams at a coffee shop downtown, where he was holding court with a group of attorneys, discussing some merger that would apparently reshape the entire telecommunications industry. He was everything her father had taught her to be wary of: polished and smooth-talking, the kind of man who could sell ice to an Eskimo and make them thank him for the privilege. But there was something magnetic about his confidence, the way he commanded attention without seeming to try. When he approached her table and commented on the architectural drawings she was reviewing, she found herself charmed by his genuine curiosity about her work. Their courtship had been a whirlwind of expensive dinners and weekend getaways to his family's cabin in the mountains. David seemed fascinated by her independence, constantly telling friends how refreshing it was to date someone who didn't need him to change a light bulb. He'd joke about her tool collection, calling her his little construction worker, in a tone that made her stomach flutter rather than bristle. Looking back, Sarah realized she should have paid more attention to the subtle ways he'd begun suggesting improvements to her appearance, her career trajectory, her life choices. The changes started small after they married. David would casually mention that maybe she didn't need to take on so many residential projects, that commercial work was more prestigious and would reflect better on both of them. He'd suggest she hire more staff so she wouldn't have to get her hands dirty as often, painting it as a natural evolution of her success rather than an attempt to reshape her into someone more palatable to his social circle. When she'd come home exhausted and paint splattered from a particularly challenging renovation, he'd wrinkle his nose and remind her that they had a dinner party that weekend with important clients. The breaking point had come 6 months ago, during what should have been a celebration of her biggest contract yet, a complete renovation of the historic Riverside Community Center. Sarah had been so proud, knowing the project would cement her reputation and provide steady work for her small crew for nearly a year. But when she'd excitedly shared the news over dinner, David's first question wasn't about her achievement or her pride in landing such a significant job. Instead, he'd asked if she'd considered subcontracting the actual construction work and focusing on project management, suggesting that at her level, she shouldn't be swinging hammers alongside her employees. The argument that followed had been devastating, not because of its intensity, but because of its quiet, methodical destruction of everything Sarah thought she knew about her marriage. David had calmly explained that he was simply looking out for her future, that successful business people delegated physical labor to others, that his law firm partners were starting to ask questions about why his wife still showed up to social events with calloused hands and dirt under her fingernails. He'd suggested she take some time to think about what kind of life they wanted to build together, and whether her current career path was compatible with his growing practice and their long-term goals. That night, lying awake beside her sleeping husband, Sarah had felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. The woman who'd learned to trust her instincts above all else suddenly found herself questioning every decision, every belief, every dream she'd held about her future. David's words echoed in the darkness, mixing with her father's voice, teaching her about integrity and self-reliance, creating a cacophony of confusion that left her paralyzed with doubt. She'd tried to compromise, taking on more supervisory roles and letting her foreman Jake handle the hands-on work she'd always loved. But something vital had been lost in translation, a connection between her vision and its execution that made every project feel incomplete. Her crew noticed the change, Jake particularly, who'd worked with her since she'd started the business and had never seen her so disconnected from the actual construction process. He'd tried to draw her back in, asking for her input on technical challenges and inviting her to problem-solve alongside them, but David's criticisms had poisoned the well of her confidence. The final straw had come during a family barbecue at David's parents' house, when his mother had made a comment about how nice it was that Sarah was finally learning to be more of a lady, delegating the rough work to men who were better suited for it. The comment had been delivered with such casual condescension that Sarah had simply smiled and nodded, but inside, she'd felt something precious and irreplaceable wither away. She'd excused herself to the bathroom and stared at her reflection in the mirror, seeing a stranger wearing her face, someone who'd learned to apologize for her strengths instead of celebrating them. Now, standing in her flooded kitchen with water seeping into the hardwood floors that David had insisted on, despite her warnings about their impracticality, Sarah felt the weight of every compromise she'd made over the past year. The pipe under the sink had been leaking for weeks, a slow drip that David had promised to call a plumber about but somehow never quite got around to scheduling. This morning, the drip had become a spray, and by the time Sarah had gotten home from a client meeting, it had escalated into a full cascade that threatened to damage not just the floors but potentially the subflooring and even the ceiling below. She'd called David immediately, explaining the situation and asking if he could contact their usual plumber for an emergency appointment. His response had been a frustrated sigh and a reminder that his mother was coming for dinner, that this was exactly the kind of crisis that could have been prevented if Sarah had been more proactive about home maintenance. He'd suggested she call someone herself, then added that maybe this was a good opportunity for her to practice the kind of project management skills she'd been developing, coordinating contractors rather than trying to fix things herself. The dismissal in his tone had hit her like a physical blow. Here was an emergency that required immediate attention, something she was perfectly capable of handling, and her husband's primary concern was protecting his evening plans and reinforcing the boundaries he'd drawn around her competence. Sarah had hung up the phone and stared at the spreading puddle, feeling something snap inside her chest like an over-tightened guitar string. She'd grabbed her emergency toolkit from the garage, the compact collection of essential tools she'd assembled years ago for exactly these kinds of situations. Her hands had remembered the weight and balance of each implement, muscle memory guiding her movements as she crawled under the sink to assess the damage. The problem was immediately obvious, a corroded fitting that had finally given way under pressure, exactly the kind of issue she'd identified and flagged during her initial walkthrough of the house before they'd purchased it. But as she'd positioned herself to begin the repair, doubt had crept in like fog rolling over a hillside. What if David was right about her approach being too hands-on? What if his mother arrived and found her under the sink with tools scattered across the floor? What if this was just another example of her inability to adapt to the kind of life David was building for them? The questions had multiplied and tangled until her hands were shaking too badly to maintain a steady grip on the wrench. The tool had slipped, the fitting had shifted, and suddenly the manageable leak had become a full-scale flood. Water pressure that had been building behind the partially loosened connection exploded outward, soaking Sarah's clothes and creating the disaster she now faced. In 15 minutes, David's mother would ring the doorbell expecting to find a perfectly appointed home and a daughter-in-law who exemplified the kind of refined femininity she'd raised her son to expect in a wife. Sarah sat back on her heels, water pooling around her knees, and felt tears mixing with the spray from the broken pipe. This wasn't about plumbing or dinner parties or in-laws. This was about a woman who'd lost herself so completely in someone else's vision of who she should be that she could no longer trust her own hands to do the work they'd been trained for. She'd allowed doubt to poison her confidence, criticism to erode her competence, and fear of judgment to paralyze her in the face of a problem she could solve in her sleep. The doorbell's chime cut through the sound of running water like a knife through silence. Sarah closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and made a decision that would change everything. She wasn't going to call a plumber, wasn't going to wait for David to handle the situation, and wasn't going to apologize for the flood or the chaos or the fact that she was about to fix her own sink while wearing a soaked blouse and muddy jeans. She was going to remember who she'd been before she'd started editing herself to fit someone else's expectations. And if that meant David's mother found her under the sink with a wrench in her hand, then maybe it was time for some uncomfortable conversations about what kind of woman David had actually married, and whether he was brave enough to love all of her instead of just the parts that made him comfortable. The doorbell rang again, more insistent this time, and Sarah Chen reached for her wrench with steady hands and a heart full of quiet rebellion. The flood could wait 5 more minutes. First, she had a sink to fix and a backbone to rediscover. But the woman at the door wasn't David's mother. Instead, Sarah found herself face to face with someone she'd never seen before. A woman about her own age with kind eyes and an apologetic smile. She was holding a covered dish and wearing the slightly frazzled expression of someone who'd realized they might be at the wrong address. "I'm so sorry to bother you," the woman said, noticing Sarah's soaked appearance and the sound of water hitting tile echoing from the kitchen. "I'm Maria Santos. I just moved in next door, and I was bringing over some enchiladas as a welcome to the neighborhood thing, but it sounds like you're dealing with a crisis." Sarah felt something loosen in her chest at the genuine concern in Maria's voice. Here was a stranger offering help instead of judgment, kindness instead of criticism. "I'm Sarah," she managed, stepping aside to let Maria see the extent of the flooding. "And yes, definitely a crisis. My sink decided to explode right before my mother-in-law is supposed to arrive for dinner." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Maria set the covered dish on the hallway table and rolled up her sleeves without hesitation. "I'm a trauma nurse at General Hospital, so I'm pretty good in emergency situations. What can I do to help?" The offer was so immediate and practical that Sarah felt tears threatening again, but this time from relief rather than frustration. "I need to shut off the water to the house and fix the fitting under the sink, but I'm second-guessing myself and making everything worse." "Okay," Maria said, following Sarah into the kitchen and surveying the scene with the calm assessment of someone accustomed to chaos. "Where's your water main, and what tools do you need?" For the next 20 minutes, Sarah rediscovered what it felt like to work alongside someone who trusted her competence, without question. Maria followed her instructions precisely, holding flashlights and fetching tools and offering encouragement when Sarah's hands started to shake from anxiety rather than cold water. There was no judgment in Maria's voice when she asked questions, no suggestion that perhaps they should call a professional or wait for David to handle the situation. Instead, Maria treated Sarah like exactly what she was, a skilled contractor dealing with a plumbing emergency in her own home. She held the pipe steady while Sarah tightened the new fitting, mopped up water without being asked, and even helped move the kitchen table to prevent further damage to the hardwood floors. When Sarah finally crawled out from under the sink and turned the water back on to test her repair, Maria cheered as if she'd just witnessed a surgical miracle. "That was incredible," Maria said, helping Sarah clean up the scattered tools. "You diagnosed the problem, sourced the right replacement part from your own supplies, and fixed it in under half an hour. My ex-husband would have stood there scratching his head for twice that long before calling someone else to handle it." The casual mention of an ex-husband caught Sarah's attention, but it was Maria's obvious admiration for her skills that made the bigger impact. When was the last time someone had celebrated her competence instead of questioning it? When had anyone expressed genuine appreciation for her ability to solve problems with her own hands? "Thank you," Sarah said, and meant it more deeply than Maria could possibly know. "I don't think I could have handled this alone today. I've been doubting myself a lot lately, and it was affecting my ability to just do the work." Maria's expression softened with understanding. "Been there. Sometimes we need someone else to remind us who we really are, especially when we've been listening to voices that make us smaller instead of bigger." Before Sarah could respond, the sound of David's car in the driveway announced his arrival with his mother. Sarah looked down at her soaked clothes and tool-scattered kitchen, then at Maria, who was calmly drying her hands on a kitchen towel, as if helping neighbors fix their plumbing was the most natural thing in the world. "Go change," Maria said quietly. "I'll explain to them what happened and how brilliantly you handled it. And Sarah, don't you dare apologize for being exactly who you're supposed to be." As Sarah headed upstairs to change clothes, she heard the front door open and David's voice calling her name with the particular edge that meant he was already preparing to be embarrassed by whatever scene he might find. But for the first time in months, Sarah felt no urge to rush to apologize or explain or minimize the situation. She'd fixed her own sink, saved her floors from serious damage, and found an ally in the most unexpected place. Whatever conversation awaited her downstairs, she would face it as the woman who'd just reminded herself that her hands were steady, her skills were valuable, and her instincts were worth trusting. The woman in the bathroom mirror looked familiar for the first time in a very long time, and Sarah Chen smiled at her reflection before heading downstairs to introduce her husband to the neighbor who'd helped her remember who she really was. But what she found in her kitchen would challenge everything she thought she knew about her marriage, her choices, and the kind of life she was willing to accept. Maria was standing near the repaired sink, gesturing to the tidy workspace and explaining the emergency to David and his mother, with the clear, confident language of someone accustomed to briefing doctors during medical crises. David's response would echo in Sarah's mind for days to come, a single sentence that crystallized everything wrong with the compromises she'd been making and everything right about the path she was about to choose. But first, she had to hear it spoken aloud, had to witness the moment when someone else's admiration for her skills collided with her husband's embarrassment about who she truly was. The conversation that followed would change the trajectory of her life, but not in any way she could have anticipated when she'd first picked up that wrench with trembling hands. Sometimes the most important repairs happen not to broken pipes, but to broken beliefs about who we're allowed to be and what we're capable of accomplishing when we trust ourselves enough to try. David's voice carried up the stairs with that particular tone Sarah had learned to recognize, the one he used when he was already crafting the story he'd tell his colleagues about his wife's latest mishap. She could hear him explaining the situation to his mother, Margaret Williams, whose disapproving silence spoke volumes even from 2 floors away. Sarah took her time changing into dry clothes, choosing a simple blouse and jeans rather than the dress she'd originally planned to wear for dinner. Something about Maria's easy acceptance of her competence had shifted her perspective on what this evening should represent. When she finally descended the stairs, the scene in her kitchen was exactly what she'd expected, and somehow worse than she'd prepared for. David stood with his arms crossed, surveying the damp towels and scattered tools with the expression of a man whose carefully controlled world had been disrupted by forces beyond his understanding. His mother sat primly at the kitchen table, her purse clutched in her lap like a shield against the chaos of actual life happening around her. But Maria stood her ground near the sink, radiating the calm confidence of someone who'd spent years managing crises in hospital emergency rooms. She was explaining the repair process to Margaret with the same patient thoroughness she'd probably used to walk a worried family member through a medical procedure, treating Sarah's skills as something worthy of respect and admiration rather than embarrassment. The corrosion had compromised the fitting completely, Maria was saying, gesturing to the old pipe joint that Sarah had placed on the counter as evidence of the problem's severity. If Sarah hadn't acted quickly, you would have been looking at significant structural damage to the subflooring, possibly affecting the ceiling in the room below. She saved you thousands of dollars in repairs with her fast thinking and technical expertise. Margaret's expression suggested she found this explanation less compelling than Maria intended. "I'm sure it was very impressive," she said in the tone she might use to praise a child's finger painting. "Though I do wonder why David wasn't here to handle such things. Men are generally better equipped for these kinds of emergencies." The comment hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished match, acrid and lingering. Sarah felt her jaw tighten, but before she could respond, Maria's voice cut through the tension with surgical precision. "Actually, in my experience working with trauma cases, I've found that skill and training matter far more than gender when it comes to handling emergencies," Maria said, her tone remaining professionally pleasant while carrying an unmistakable edge. Sarah's response time and technical competence probably prevented this from becoming a much more serious situation. "You should be proud to have such a capable daughter-in-law." David shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing that the conversation was veering into territory he'd prefer to avoid. "Well, it's all sorted now," he said with forced cheerfulness, moving to place a possessive hand on Sarah's shoulder. "Though I do wish you'd called me before attempting the repair yourself, honey. We've discussed how important it is for you to focus on the bigger picture rather than getting caught up in the hands-on details." Sarah felt Maria's eyes on her, sharp and assessing, taking in the subtle dynamics of the exchange. There was something in the other woman's expression that reminded Sarah of her father, the way he'd look at customers who tried to convince him they knew more about hardware than he did despite having never held a wrench in their lives. "The bigger picture?" Maria asked, and Sarah could hear genuine curiosity in her voice rather than confrontation. "What do you mean by that?" David straightened, clearly pleased to have an opportunity to explain his perspective to a new audience. Sarah's incredibly talented, of course, but she's at a stage in her career where she should be delegating the actual construction work to her employees. Project management, client relations, business development, that's where her time is best invested. Getting under sinks to fix pipes is something any handyman could handle. The words landed like physical blows, each one stripping away another layer of the confidence Sarah had just reclaimed. She watched Maria's expression change, saw the moment when professional politeness gave way to something much sharper and more honest. "Any handyman," Maria repeated slowly, as if testing the phrase for accuracy. "You mean like the ones who charge $200 for emergency calls and might not be available for hours in a situation like this? The ones who would need to diagnose the problem, source parts, and potentially cause more damage while learning your home's specific plumbing configuration?" Margaret cleared her throat disapprovingly. "I hardly think this is an appropriate topic for dinner conversation." But Maria wasn't finished. She turned to Sarah, ignoring both David and his mother with the focused attention of someone who'd learned to cut through noise and politics to reach the truth of a situation. "How long did it take you to identify the problem and complete the repair?" Maria asked. "About 20 minutes," Sarah answered quietly, feeling David's hand tighten on her shoulder in what might have been support or warning. 20 minutes, Maria mused. "Including sourcing the replacement fitting from your own supply inventory, I assume, since you mentioned you keep emergency repair materials on hand." Sarah nodded, wondering where this line of questioning was heading, but finding herself unable to look away from Maria's intense focus. "And the repair is guaranteed to hold, because you understand the water pressure specifications for this house and selected materials that exceed those requirements by a safe margin." "Yes," Sarah said, feeling something unfamiliar and powerful stirring in her chest as Maria methodically dismantled every assumption underlying David's criticism. Maria turned back to David with the expression Sarah imagined she used when delivering difficult diagnoses to patients who'd been ignoring obvious symptoms for too long. "So what you're telling me," Maria said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, "is that you'd prefer your wife to delay solving an emergency that could cause thousands of dollars in damage, pay a premium for someone else to do work she's more qualified to perform, and waste hours of time that could be spent on higher-value activities, all so she can avoid getting her hands dirty with the kind of technical expertise that most people spend years trying to develop." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah could hear the kitchen clock ticking, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the sound of her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. David's hand had gone very still on her shoulder, and Margaret looked as if she'd swallowed something distasteful. "I think," Margaret said finally, gathering her purse with the deliberate movements of someone preparing to retreat from an uncomfortable battlefield, "that perhaps we should reschedule dinner for another evening. David, I'll wait in the car." She swept from the kitchen with the dignified outrage of someone who'd never been required to question her assumptions about anything, leaving behind an atmosphere thick with unspoken tensions and uncomfortable realizations. David watched his mother leave, then turned to Maria with the forced smile he used when trying to diffuse situations that had spiraled beyond his control. "I appreciate your help with the emergency," he said, though his tone suggested the opposite. "I'm sure Sarah is grateful for your assistance. But I think there may have been some miscommunication about our household dynamics and Sarah's career goals." Maria looked at David for a long moment, then back at Sarah, who stood frozen between her husband's implied criticism and a stranger's fierce defense of her competence. "No miscommunication," Maria said quietly. "I saw exactly what happened here." Sarah handled a crisis with skill and efficiency that would impress any professional in the trades. The fact that anyone would find that embarrassing rather than admirable says more about their insecurities than her abilities. She moved toward the door, pausing to look back at Sarah with an expression that somehow managed to be both sad and hopeful. "Your repair work was flawless," she said. "Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." After Maria left, the kitchen felt different, charged with the weight of things that had been said, and others that remained unspoken. David stood near the window, watching his mother's car disappear down the street, his reflection ghost-like in the evening darkened glass. "Well," he said finally, turning back to Sarah with an expression she couldn't quite read. That was certainly an interesting introduction to the neighborhood. Sarah felt something crystallizing inside her chest, a clarity that had been building since the moment she'd first picked up her wrench and chosen action over paralysis. "David," she said, her voice steadier than it had been in months, "we need to talk." He sighed, the sound of a man who'd recognized that his evening was about to become more complicated than he'd planned. "If this is about what happened with my mother, I'm sure she'll come around. She just needs time to adjust to having such an independent daughter-in-law." "It's not about your mother," Sarah said, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. "It's about us. About who you married and who you've been trying to turn me into." David's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do," Sarah said, and for the first time in a year she felt completely certain of her ground. "You married a contractor, David. Someone who builds things with her own hands and takes pride in solving problems that other people can't handle. But ever since our wedding, you've been trying to convince me that those qualities are something to be ashamed of rather than celebrated." He started to protest, but Sarah held up a hand to stop him. "Tonight, a stranger who'd known me for 20 minutes showed more respect for my skills than my own husband has in months. She didn't suggest I call someone else, or worry about what people might think, or try to convince me that getting my hands dirty was beneath my station in life." David's jaw tightened. "That's not fair, Sarah. I've always supported your career." "You've supported the version of my career that makes you comfortable," Sarah corrected. "The parts that sound impressive at dinner parties without requiring you to defend why your wife knows which end of a hammer to hold." The words hung between them like a bridge neither of them was sure they wanted to cross. Sarah could see David calculating, trying to determine whether this was a momentary rebellion that could be managed with the right combination of logic and affection, or something more fundamental that would require actual change. "What do you want from me?" he asked finally. The question was simple, but Sarah realized she wasn't sure she had a simple answer. What she wanted was to feel like herself again, to trust her instincts and value her skills, and stop apologizing for being exactly who she'd always been. What she wanted was a partner who celebrated her competence rather than managing it, who saw her calloused hands as evidence of expertise rather than embarrassment. What she wanted, she realized with startling clarity, was to be loved for all of herself, not just the parts that fit comfortably into someone else's vision of who she should be. "I want you to be proud of me," she said simply. "All of me. The woman who can fix your sink and build your deck and solve problems you can't even identify. I want you to brag about my skills instead of making excuses for them." David looked at her for a long moment, and Sarah could see him weighing her words against his own needs and expectations and social calculations. "And if I can't do that?" he asked quietly. The question contained the seeds of everything that would follow, the recognition that some differences couldn't be compromised away or managed into compatibility. Sarah looked around her kitchen, at the tools she'd scattered and gathered, at the sink she'd repaired with her own steady hands, at the home they'd built together on foundations that were proving less solid than either of them had realized. "Then we'll have to figure out what that means," she said. Outside, the neighborhood settled into evening quiet, lights coming on in windows where other couples were probably navigating their own complicated negotiations between love and compromise, between accepting each other as they were and trying to shape each other into who they thought they needed. But in Sarah's kitchen, beside the sink she'd fixed herself, two people stood on opposite sides of a question that would determine everything about their future. Whether love meant changing yourself to fit someone else's expectations, or finding someone brave enough to love you exactly as you were meant to be. The answer, Sarah was beginning to understand, would require courage from both of them, but perhaps not the same kind of courage, or in service of the same dreams. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.